Welcome back. We're now going to look at pages 6 and 7 of the WB-11, the offer to purchase for residential. So again, page 6 is more boilerplate. And so read it, read it, read it. It talks about distribution of information. It does talk about defaults. So what happens if one of the other sides defaults? So if the buyer defaults, what the options the seller has, or if the seller defaults, what the option the buyers have. Talk about the entire contract, and then notice about sex offender registry as well. So this is for the buyer to say if there's concern about that, here's where you go, and you can find out in the neighborhood if there's any registered sex offenders residing there. And then we're going to move on to page 7. So again, more opportunities to add language. So double check that the property address is in there. You see it's pre-filled. Now, if the buyer had a house to sell and they wanted to make the offer contingent upon getting their house sold, you would add this contingency in, which is a buyer's property contingency. I will tell you this, in the market of the moment, where it's a strong seller's market, this will be difficult in almost every case to get a seller to accept. Not impossible, just know that it's difficult. So just know that. Secondary offer would be if we had knowledge that the seller had already accepted another offer in primary. The seller cannot accept two offers, yet you could submit your offer in secondary position. Now let's just read through this because there's one thing I want to make certain you understand in this one. It says the offer is secondary to a prior accepted offer. This offer shall become primary upon delivery of written notice to buyer that the offer is primary. Unless otherwise provided, seller is not obligated to give buyer notice prior to any deadline, nor is it particularly secondary buyer given the right to be made primary ahead of other buyers. Be clear about that. So let's say it's a super hot property, and it does have an accepted offer, not with your buyer, but with a seller that has a buyer that has a subject to sale. They want to have this option to close on their property, and so you write your offer. It gets negotiated into secondary position. The seller then is given notice that, or the first buyer is now given notice that their offer has to drop this contingency or back out. And one of the things I think most agents think is that the secondary offer, right of what secondary offer gets chosen next, is based on when they were accepted. So let's say the seller accepted three secondary offers. Once they've given notice to the primary offer and the primary backs away, the seller can choose any of those three if this language stays as it is. So what I'd recommend, now this is a little complicated, yet I'd recommend this, is that I would strike it out, right? So what I would do is I would strike from here. Let's see. Let's see. Where is it? This nor any particular secondary offer given primary against any others. I would strike that. And then I would go under additional provisions. So I might go back to I had lines back on page 3. Do you see that? And I'm going to reference, now this is getting a little complicated, but I want to make sure you know that. I'm going to reference lines 314 of the offer to purchase. And so I'm going to just add that language here. So I'm going to say per line 314 of WB-11, buyer's offer in secondary shall become primary over all other secondary offers. Does that make sense? So basically what I'm saying, now again, this can be negotiated, but if it's not there, then chances are it won't happen. So that's just one thing to kind of look at. It's a little tricky, and yet we want to make certain that you and your buyer understands that. Now, it does say that the buyer may declare the offer null and void by delivering written notice of the withdrawal to the seller prior to the delivery of the seller's notice that the offer is primary. So, you could be put in secondary position. Your buyer can keep looking for other properties. If you find one they want to move forward with, and they haven't gotten notice yet from the seller's listing agent, they can withdraw. Now, the next line, though, gets a little confused with people, but it says buyer may not deliver written notice of withdrawal earlier than blank days after acceptance of the offer. So here's why that's there. So let's say you are in secondary position. There is a subject to sale clause with the primary, and you've learned from the listing agent there's a 48-hour bump, meaning that from the time they accept your offer in secondary and give notice to the buyer in primary, they have 48 hours to either withdraw the contingency or back out. what they want to make certain of is that your seller or your buyer doesn't back out during that time either. So I would say no earlier than, because if it's 48 hours, that's 2 days. I'd say we're not going to give notice any sooner than 3 days after acceptance of the offer. Again, that's I think that's in fairness to all parties. It says all other offer deadlines which run from acceptance shall run from the time the offer becomes primary. So again, you've got deadlines for inspection, you're going to have deadlines for financing. None of that happens until your offer goes from secondary to primary. Let's say I check that box, so now we're there. Now here's one thing just to know, and this isn't an excuse to be sloppy. It does say that if any of the blanks are filled out in any of these contingencies, that it is considered part of the offer, but just make sure that you've got the box checked. Next one talks about time is of the essence. As to earnest money payments, binding acceptance, occupancy, date of closing, contingency deadlines, and anything else. Now, here's in the market of the moment, you might want to think about this. For example, your buyer might say we're in a month-to-month lease. We don't absolutely have to close by June 22nd. If the seller needs more time, we can give them that. You could strike date of closing. Once you do that, though, know that you've got very little leverage. So as a general rule, what I would do is I just not touch this at all. Just leave it exactly how it is. Next area talks about title, and it says that upon payment of the purchase price, seller will convey title by warranty deed or trustee deed if it's in a trust, or personal representative deed if it's a estate, that kind of thing. Free and clear of all liens and encumbrances except these, so just read that. And it says, let's see, present use of the property in violation of the foregoing disclosed in the seller's real estate condition report in this offer. So there was something that they knew that they disclosed. You're acknowledging you know that. And then if there's anything else that you want to make sure is covered on title, typically there's not. So I just type in none other, or you can type in any other. That would be okay too. Just kind of a catch-all. And quite frankly, I don't know what the correct answer is. I just know I don't like to leave anything blank. So now, there is a warning on line 337. It says municipal and zoning ordinances recording building and use restrictions, covenants, and easements may prohibit certain improvements or uses, therefore should be reviewed, particularly if the buyer contemplates making improvements to the property use other than the current use. What would some of those things be? A fence could be an issue, so you want to double check that before they move forward and get into a contract. They has a giant garage on the property, and the buyer wants to turn it into an auto repair business. That may be allowed in zoning, it may not be, so you want to make sure that you address that typically prior to making the offer, or write something in the offer that allows that to be a condition of the seller or the buyer having to close. So that's the type of thing. Title evidence just talks about how it's going to be given. Line 343, another one that gets forgotten a lot. So it does say if nothing is struck, the seller is the answer. We like to be clear about our contracts, so be careful with this one. It's just saying that the seller will provide a gap endorsement coverage on title at the seller's expense if you don't strike anything. Typically, that's how it is. Now, if you know you're going to be competing, and you know that the gap isn't that expensive, you might sweeten your offer by saying it's going to be at the buyer's expense. If I'm competing with other offers and I want to make mine look great, and yet I still want to make sure that the buyer gets gap coverage, that's what you could do. Now, what is gap coverage? Gap coverage is coverage on the title from the time that the title search is done to the day of closing. Meaning that when title search is done, that's the last time that's looked at as far as what's there on title. And let's say that a shifty list seller goes out from the time the title search was done to closing and does something that puts a lien against the property. Well, it wasn't found during the time of the title search, so it's not showing up there, not addressed. But if it does come up later, then there's an insurance coverage over that for the buyer, because a lien stays with the property, not with the property owner. So once the seller closes, they're free and clear of that. This gap insurance coverage covers that gap of time from the commitment, the search for title to the time of closing. Just talks about merchantable title, what there is. Now, here's something to read, though, because it does talk about it has to be provided within a certain period of time, and then there's time for review by the buyer. And if they don't like that, they have the right to call the offer null and void because of that. So you do want to read that as well. And that's pages 6 and 7 of the WB-11.